Hey, this is Brian, the main contributor to the Smart Connections Obsidian plugin, and I'm about to go through the different GitHub issues that I have been unable to respond to. It takes a lot of time to read through the issues and formulate a good response, so I'm hoping that by recording my process, you can see what I'm thinking as I'm coming up with the response, and hopefully that will provide you with more insights on what the future of smart connections look like, and also answer whatever questions it is that you had in the issue itself. Thanks for watching, and let's get started. Okay, this next one should be quick. Add a lock button. Let's just go with closing in favor of number 46. Basically, the request is, to keep the current results in the smart view, keep them there until you unlock the results. Issue 46 addresses that here. So I added a few notes about what needs to be done. Let's record a response. If you want to know more about that, I suggest checking out the video that will be added to that issue number 46. Okay. Next one, issue number 159, feature request, customizable system message prompts. Okay, we got Sarah here. She's a Smart Connections power user and one of the earliest supporters, so thank you to her for keeping the momentum of Smart Connections, helping start the momentum and, really keeping it going and constantly providing me great feedback. She's been a big help with all that. Okay, so, this one still needs work. I don't have a response for this one. It's not going to be closed. I think right now we have some system prompts feature where essentially you can mention a note that is in the system prompts folder. I'll give you a quick look at how that works. So we've got your smart chat there. We've got the system prompts folder, smart prompts. Now, let's say you go type @ here, let's see if there's one that we might be able to use. Like, let's just say, okay, write a thank you note. I said, hello, write a thank you note. That should cause the response. It did seem to, okay, so you see system prompt included. It's asking me about the person I want to thank, what did they do for you? So that's how the current system prompt function works. However, I think what Sarah might be getting at is more like the custom instructions that are available in the ChatGPT software. So I'm going to just leave this one as is for now. I'll have this response video added later. I think there's a lot that can be done with system prompts. This one definitely just will need to be addressed in the future. Issue 160. Updating my current embedding file for more efficient versions. Okay, so let's just go with, closing this for now since a lot has changed. If performance is an issue, please create a new. If performance is still a concern, please create a new issue to help clarify in terms of the latest updates. So when this last comment was added, we were still on version 2.1. I mean, version 1. Version 2 came out at the beginning of 2024. There's been a lot. I basically spent a few months rewriting the code. That's how I came up with the smart environment architecture. So in short, the performance issues that occurred in version 1, while they may not all have been solved, it's very likely that the performance issue is a little bit different, in version 2 with the new architecture. So if we can, if there's issues with performance, it'd be best to open a new issue, with regards to the updates. Next, issue number 163, feature request, command plus enter shortcut in chat to send message. This is a little tricky one. Basically, it's like registering the keys correctly is like, it gets a little tricky, because you're competing with Obsidian hotkeys and the order in which they're registered. So right now, the fastest way to send the chat message is going to be tab and then enter, which is like less than ideal. I definitely agree the control or command enter press would be best. So I'm going to also leave this one unanswered for now. And then as the code continues to improve, I think it'll become more and more obvious. So like I'm trying to do my best to pull out all of the essential components of the plugin. So what that means is like there's a chat component, and when compared to the entire code base, the chat component is like relatively small. So I think that getting the command enter working is going to take a little bit of just like trial and error, but maybe somebody will have the will to contribute that. I understand right now I need to do a better job of explaining how to contribute code wise. Up until this point, the code has really been almost uncontributable. The reason is like prior to like the version 1 architecture was just a spaghetti code mess. You didn't even want to waste your time looking at that. The new architecture, there's the component and adapter patterns that make jumping in and improving a specific aspect of the plugin much easier. And I see coming up will be the language issue. Let's check that out. So issue number 165. I'm going to leave this recorded response. So right now, retrieval is triggered by self-referential pronouns. Basically, if you're in the chat and you say, based on my notes, you're referring to yourself, and then the chat knows, okay, grab some context. This is a rudimentary type of like short-term hack to really just like improve the UX. So like this way you're going to get that response as fast as possible. There is something that wasn't on my radar back when this last response was inputted, and that is function calling. So I'm slowly moving over the way that the Smart Chat retrieves context from this self-referential method to one that's more dependent on function calls. So what that means is instead of triggering the lookup based on a self-referential pronoun, it might trigger the lookup just without a self-referential pronoun, and it would do this by keeping function calls or tool calls, they're also known by, in the request that is sent to the model, and then this basically gives the model an option to perform a lookup. Now I think that the self-referential aspect really makes controlling the chat a lot easier. So once you get familiar with the basically keywords that trigger a lookup, it becomes much easier to work with the chat. And without that, there's a chance that even if you say, like, based on my notes, there's a chance that, like, let's say the conversation has, 10 messages in it, like the AI could assume that by your notes, you mean the prior chat messages, so like it gets a little more iffy there. But yeah, so the last thing I have to say about this is, personally, I do not intend on implementing, significant language support myself. But what I do plan on doing is making that support available via an adapter pattern, like all the other modules in the JS Brains project. So, like the current method is as simple as listing these pronouns in a file, and so I don't imagine the adapters being any more complex than that. I still have some decisions to make on where those adapters will exist. So for example, it could be a part of the Smart Chat model. That's a module that enables access to all of the AIs through a single interface. So this way, when I'm writing code for the Smart Chat, I can quickly switch between Anthropic, Google, OpenAI, or even local models without having to rewrite the Smart Chat code. So it's like a universal adapter for the different model platforms. There's a chance that the translation and language support goes there, but there's another place which are actions, like the smart actions are what I refer to as, these function calls or tool calls. These are actions that can be performed by the model. So right now, for retrieval using actions, there's a lookup action. So I imagine we can have some derivatives of these smart actions, or maybe even adapters, or built-in configuration for the lookup action that would support more languages. And one last thing to consider is that the language models are fairly multilingual. So what that means is, like as we move away from the self-referential pronoun paradigm and rely more on the tool calls, we can expect that whether or not you're having a chat in the Turkish language or whatever your native language may be, the tool call that may be written in English will still perform relatively the same. That's my hypothesis. It's yet to be tested. I think that there's probably some other people working on some papers that will illuminate that that idea in the near term if it hasn't already been done. But as far as additional language support, I think that is going to cover my thoughts on that. Okay, let's fixed views from resetting their location. I believe this is fixed. It is fixed in the latest versions. Please let me know if you're still having the issue. Okay. So I stack my smart view and my smart chat. I typically have the smart view on the top right column and the smart chat below it. And as far as my memory goes, I haven't had any issues having to move those back and forth. So this one should be fixed. Let's get to another. Issue number 170. Okay. Use a tab windows instead of panel for the chat view. Okay, I mean, it's an enhancement. I don't think much has to be said about this. So one of the reasons I mentioned in an earlier video that I want to, pull the Smart Chat into its own companion plugin to Smart Connections is because there's getting to be a lot of configurations. like a lot of possible, individual preferences from, toggles to, just different model configurations. So I think it would make sense to, divvy out that load onto some other plugins that utilize smart connections. And also definitely don't see why the smart chat would require, smart connections. If you don't want access to your notes within the chat, you just want the, the chat to be right there in Obsidian for you, that will be a possibility too. As I mentioned in another video, I don't see the smart chat being pulled out into its own plugin, in the near future. It'll be likely in some time. And in that new plugin, I think it'll make a lot more sense to have this sort of feature. So you might want to, load the chat in the main window. You might want to load the chat on the left pane instead of the right pane. I think those are, valuable options to include in the plugin. Right now it's just starting to get a little cluttered with all the options. That's one of the reasons why I've started moving some settings into the actual views in the side panel. There's still some redundancy there that I've left in order to get people used to engaging with the settings in the panel, but I think it makes sense to start removing those, or at least like collapsing or shrinking their presence in the main settings screen. Okay, one last note on this. I think if you just drag the smart chat panel into the main window and then you pin it, there's the pin feature. That'll probably keep it there. So if you're looking for like a way to have the chat view in the main window and keep it there, pin it and see how that works. I think, based on the last issue that wanted the view to remain in the same spot, I'm guessing that that'll apply to the main window too. Okay. Included folders. So this is another one I think that we have addressed. Okay, so let's okay, so closing in favor of, okay, so if you're interested in knowing more about my thoughts on the inclusion filter, including how you can improve the process of excluding many folders, check out that other issue. Let's get this one more before we move on to a new video. Okay, API error. So this can mean many things. Basically, if you encounter this, you're going to want to look at the developer console logs. Like there's been plenty of mentions of how to access developer console logs. So please just search the GitHub, so I don't have to go through that again. So I'm going to, so like this, basically when you see this, it just means there was an error, and you should check those console logs and take that error that you find and share that, preferably a screenshot. A screenshot is a lot of help because like the formatting is just not pretty when you copy and paste those logs, and it makes it much harder to read. There's like color coding and stuff in the logs that helps me, so closing this in favor of issues that specify the exact error which can be found in the developer console logs. Okay, so closing that. Okay, and on to the next video.